Supervise PhDs, a podcast series by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, my name's Tara Brabazon.
And I'm Steve Redhead.
And welcome to this fifth podcast, yes, number 5, in our series, How to Supervise PhDs. And our topic for this podcast is, I believe, the most important. Steve may not, but I actually think this is the most important bit of the story, the student-supervisor relationship. Now, as we talked about in our introductory podcast, guys, I can't convey to you the hundreds of complaints that I have received from students around the world. And all of them, all of them have been about the student treatment by a supervisor or supervisors. So therefore, Steve, question 1, let's get into it. Why is the postgraduate supervisor relationship so vexed?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer, but it is vexed. And I think it's always been vexed. In my experience, certainly, the same sorts of problems have always come up. So I don't think this is now a new problem. I think it's a globalisation of problems that have always existed in this relationship. I mean, I can think back to when I did a master's degree by research, and I had a supervisor who I thought was reading my work all the way through the year. I was on a scholarship and really wanted to get it finished in a particular time. And there was a lot of empirical research involved in sociology of law. And I remember handing in my final chapter, or going to hand in my final chapter, and I was listening outside his door. He was talking to somebody else, and it was obvious from this conversation that he hadn't actually read the earlier work. He was actually not aware of what I'd done in the earlier work. So I learned that he hadn't actually read the earlier chapters, and I was coming to bring my final one. And I'd thought all of the time that he was, basically reading the work and approving it and so on, and it wasn't true. And I absolutely panicked at that time, and I did finish it, and it was all successful and so on. And there were other kinds of problems to do with supervision and indeed the institution at that time. But I just think that relationship, the idea of trusting your supervisor, is this person actually doing the work that you think he or she is doing? And then suddenly finding out that all of the time you thought that the relationship was a good one was actually not the case. So I think the thing is vexed a lot of the time, but there is, as I've said before in these podcasts, there is an issue of regulation, both by institutions and, in fact, countries, that perhaps really does need to take this thing seriously, not just as a matter of payment of scholarships to students and how we regulate all of that, but that the student-supervisor relationship is integral to what we're talking about.
The supervisor-student relationship is like a marriage of sorts. It is a marriage without the sex. And why I mean by, hopefully, without the sex, like really without the sex, and might get to that shortly. But it is a relationship of intimacy and trust. That, a student is literally opening their life out to this person, trusting this person with 3 years of their life and their time, and they're putting their hand out and they're putting like their heart in their hand, and they're going, please don't destroy my life.
But you're doing that, I think, in undergraduate and in master's teaching as well.
It's not a serious, because in a PhD it's 3 years and it's pass or fail. It's finish or not finish. A course, you can fail a course, do the course the next semester. Nothing in academic life, I would argue, is as horrendous and important, and so much is on the line for one particular event. It might be the examination of the doctorate, it might be the oral examination. There's no other element in academic life that is as all or nothing as this.
But that's also why the supervisory team matters. And that old idea of Oxbridge system where you just have one professor supervising you is a problem. And the appropriateness of the team, which can be, perhaps 3 people sometimes, is really, really important, because that then defrays the intensity of a relationship of one-on-one, I think.
But again, in some ways that intensity can work incredibly well. Steve and I, by the way, disagree on co-supervision that you'll hear about in a new podcast in a couple of gigs, I think. But the second question, Steve, is, and again, this is important too, and this has got to be established from the start. Do you believe that key expectations should be established at the start of a candidature?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. But because the thing changes so quickly anyway, as the student becomes, as I've said before, more experienced and actually outflanks the experience of the supervisor as you go along in a PhD, it does make it difficult. But yes, in principle.
Whereas, you see, I think there are most of the complaints I receive and most of the problems I've seen when I was director of postgraduate stuff at Murdoch are in two areas. And you and I have both experienced both of them. So, and these are generalisable. These are real international problems. One, supervisors don't read the work.
Yes.
Supervisor didn't read my master's, didn't read my PhD, didn't read your master's. You had a wonderful PhD.
I did, yeah.
Supervisor. But most of the complaints I get are, this supervisor has not read a word of it.
Not a word, yeah.
So, establishing that expectation at the start, the student having the courage to say, you know what, I'm going to be expecting you to read it. I expect myself to deliver it with plenty of time so you can read it, but I have an expectation that you will read my work. The second thing is about the regularity of meetings. That actually stating, and the trouble is the research shows this, Steve, the more regular the meetings, the quicker the student finishes. So weekly meetings do actually produce a faster outcome than fortnightly meetings, okay? So if a staff member is constructing, saying, oh, look, I'll have a meeting once a semester with a couple of bottles of red wine, then that's not going to work. So do you think the expectations about the regularity of meetings, once a fortnight, or this will happen, that makes a difference?
I think regularity is a good idea, and I do think in principle, yes, you should have expectations that are agreed, but I just think you've got to be a bit flexible as well, because very often what you find, partly with the diversity of PhD candidates, a lot of the time students will be working in various, they may be teaching in the institution. I've got PhD students that are teaching within the institution, and I've had that very often where people... they're well-meaning, and the supervisor and the student are well-meaning, and they really do want to meet every week or every month or whatever it is, but actually they don't for all sorts of various reasons. I think so. There's got to be expectations are good, but also you have to build an understanding where the thing is reasonably flexible as well. And I quite like the idea. I've pursued students where I'm in my office and people come and knock on my door and say, I've got this, can we have a talk about that? Yes. Rather than, and that's not to say they don't do regular meetings as well, but it's a bit of a mixture. And I quite like that. And I got that partly from my own PhD supervision, which was very much like that. And you could knock on somebody's door and just say, have you got a minute to talk about this? And I try and be flexible like that. And even though you've got regular meetings as well, sometimes I've just got, and I think the students have got the most out of just simply someone knocking on your door when you were doing something else. Yeah.
No, that's great. See, and that's also because you're just a tragic hippie. Let's be honest here.
It's counterculture.
Yeah, just a tragic hippie. But can I say also, as listeners are picking up, that is a great way to supervise too. And I wish I had more of that. As a head of school,
yes, you can't.
I have
do that.
Zero opportunity for someone to pop in and hope for the best.
Yeah, I couldn't do it when I was head of school. But I wouldn't have had a second.
No, can I also state though, the great thing is, I'm thinking about again, Anne McLeod, you and I again, three very busy people with three very, very difficult calendars. And yet the three of us make a point of once a week, once a fortnight at the very latest, and often once a week, go, even if it's 20 minutes, even if it's 15 minutes, let's get Anne on that Skype. And we're in different locations too, can I say, guys and girls, different cities. And even if it's for 15 minutes, let's just touch base, check everybody's cool. Where are we up on this? And I think that's why Anne's progressed so well.
Oh, I agree. And there's huge improvement.
And she's the acting director of the PEU.
Yeah.
you're sub-dean, I'm head of school, 3 impossibly busy people. We almost like slam dunk together. Let's make this happen at 8 o'clock in the morning or 12:15, punch it out, and then go back into our meetings. And so that's quite powerful, I think.
Yes, and where it works, that's great. But I just don't think a fixed system always works. So expectations are good, but be prepared to be flexible and try and work out, with the supervisory team or with the individual student, the best way. I mean, I can think of examples where I say we've got PhD students who are teaching. So for whole periods, whole semesters, it's really difficult to do what we're saying.
Yeah.
Although we do manage through little meetings or knocks on doors or whatever to keep it going. But also, I can think of supervisions where, there's a supervisory team. In one case, one of the supervisory team is in the UK, the rest of the supervisory team is in Australia, but through Skype and other means, we can all get together with the student from time to time. But that's maybe, once a semester.
Yeah.
That's not to say that the sub-meetings aren't going on with the supervisory team in all sorts of ways, because they are.
And see, that can be great, because often that's about content-based stuff. The gentleman I know who you're talking about is doing this particular work with this particular theorist, so he sees you, then he's doing work on this particular idea or topic, and he goes see the other.
Absolutely.
And that's fantastic.
Yes, and indeed may speak with the overseas supervisor by Skype individually, and then we'll have a collective meeting of all of us with the student. So I think there are all sorts of ways of being flexible within that general system of agreed expectations.
Yes. I think we do need to say regularity of meetings and reading of work are incredibly important.
Yeah, they are.
Last couple of questions on this one, Stephen. I knew this one would be the juicy one, because it is the one that really matters, and this is in some ways the deal breaker. The third question is, how should problems be resolved? Now, again, that's almost impossible, because I've seen so many situations reach a point where they can't be resolved, and the supervisory team ends up changing. Are there early interventions that are possible? How can you resolve these problems?
I think you have to have a good system of candidature management, and one of the things that I find in my current role as Sub-Dean of Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts, where there are 250 PhD students at all sorts of levels of candidature, I just think I've had to relearn that in some ways, how you intervene. I mean, we have a system at Charles Sturt of very regular progress reports every 6 months by the supervisors. And the system, on the face of it, an electronic system is a great idea. But actually, you do wonder how much we're drilling down to the real problems.
Yes.
And therefore, Sub-Dean is, in my case me, relying on those progress reports to intervene in the supervisory team if there are real problems. But if that reporting system isn't honest and truthful and transparent, then how do you intervene? And the early warning thing, which is really what that's about, doesn't exist. Yes. So what you're intervening in is years, very often, of problems.
Yeah.
And can anybody in managing candidature really get that solved? The early warning thing is crucial, I think, however that is done.
Yeah, and also I'd say, and this is, again, we'll be talking about this in a couple of podcasts' time, but also thinking about the role of a sub-dean of graduate studies, or indeed a dean of graduate studies in a graduate centre.
Yes.
And they need to be fantastic people, of which you are, Dale. And it's not just a wife saying that. You need a particular type of personality, a kind, distinguished, even person who can come up with strategies and scenarios and who has their door open. So in other words, when things are going bad, young candidate, older candidate, when things are going wrong, really wrong, disturbingly, frighteningly wrong, and they can't diagnose it for themselves, they need to be able to pick up the phone, walk into an office, or send an email and say, "Hi Steve," or "Hi Phil," or "Hi Lucy, I'm in trouble, I think. Can you help me?" And so if you've got a really great sub-dean that's not judgmental and actually tries to piece together the scenario of what's occurred, that can make a difference.
It can, but
that can save a student.
It can, and I think it is a good idea, but then you've got the difficulty of managing basically hands-off, because you don't want to intervene if you can possibly help it. So intervention, which is really what this podcast series is about, in many ways, is a really difficult process because essentially you don't want to be another supervisor. If you're managing the candidature for a whole faculty or for a university, you don't want to be another supervisor.
No.
It's a really difficult process to set in train, but an important one.
But you need to be the person who can protect the student. In some ways, you're the advocate for the student.
But you could also see yourself as the protector of the supervisor too.
Yes, that's true.
There are all kinds of problems that come up, and I've only experienced it in this recent job, that I never actually came across as a supervisor.
Wow.
In all of my career. So, and therefore you are having to deal with new problems in a different way without wanting to be just, another supervisor. So the management of candidature, I absolutely agree, is really crucial. But that process is fantastically difficult, I think, to get it right.
Well said. Oh, isn't this powerful? Very powerful. Last question, and it's one of my big ticket worries. What do you think are the deal breakers? What are the deal breaker topics or ideas or events or scenarios that will destroy the supervisor-student relationship? What are the deal breakers? I have a list, but you tell me yours.
Well, you start with yours. Okay,
well, the deal breaker for me, anything weirdly sexual between the supervisor or the student, thanks for playing, over. So that's, and I don't, and I know you probably might disagree, I don't know. Even if it's inverted commas consensual, I don't think it can be consensual because there's a power differential. So anything where the staff members to the student to the staff member, if I find out about that as a head of school, as a director of postgraduate education, as a sub-dean, thanks for playing, both in the office, bang, gone, done. If the student is feeling intimidated or something weird is going on with the supervisor and I find out about it, that's a deal breaker. I do not want the students frightened, fearful or intimidated. Anything I hear about the staff member nicking or taking or using the student's work uncited, that deeply concerns me, or as an unpaid research assistant. That stuff deeply worries me, and again, I think that's a deal breaker. If a supervisor is not reading the work, that's a deal breaker. If the supervisor is not seeing the student, that's a deal breaker. Am I helping?
I think they are all really important issues, and they're all issues that I've come across, both at Charles State University and all of the other universities I've worked at around the world, in Canada, the UK and Australia. But I don't think they always manifest themselves in that
avert way. Yes.
Which is why it becomes an issue. I mean, you can for example, a lot, just because it's universities are hot houses, there are lots of relationships, marriages or whatever, which have come out of being supervisor and student, for example. I know, but that is true. The point is that those relationships went on, undetected. There were no problems with them, and so on. And what I'm saying, though, is that the things you raise, which are for regulation, are important. So you can regulate, and you can write rules for all of the things you've said, which are deal breakers. The actual application of them is difficult. So, you only find out, as I say, in progress reports. If they're transparent, you can find out that the student the staff member has never read the student's work over, 14 years candidature or whatever. Okay?
or 3 months.
Or 3 months or whatever. But you don't find out until the end. So the thing doesn't manifest itself until everything's finished. So the idea of regulating these things is a good one, and they're probably deal breakers for the university. Of any kind, but and obviously there are different regulations written across faculties, across universities, across countries, but that thing about regulating the global university and global PhDs is important, and mostly you can do it in principle you can do it on the basis of the sorts of things you've talked about. So it's not reinventing the wheel. You can have regulations for all of these things, and you can intervene, but in practice, The actual enforcement of those rules is difficult.
But what I think I've picked up from the discussion we've had today, and I didn't think we'd end up there, is you really do need a graduate centre in a university, and you need a dean of graduate studies who has his or her door open and is prepared to listen to student or supervisor, because things can go, the intimidation, the power can go the other way too.
Yeah, of course.
Things can be said that are just not true, and I've seen restraining orders from supervisors to students, so it can go both ways. But we need to have that trustworthy relationship, those of us who are leaders in postgraduate education, where the door is open and we're prepared to listen to the entirety of the situation, hopefully without judgment, and then be able to enact processes and procedures from that diagnosis.
I agree, and all of which is good, but I'm saying from a kind of socio-legal point of view, rules can be written, and in these cases they can be backed up by sanctions, but actually enforcing them is a difficult process for the sorts of reasons I've raised.
Exactly. It takes a university to complete a PhD student, and so if these networks and cycles and circles of support around students exist, and supervisors exist, then they're safe, and they're safe to perhaps tell the difficult truths at times as well.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this podcast titled How to Supervise PhDs. Please feel free to contact Steve or Tara at Charles Sturt University. We'd love to hear from you.